Everyone. We're happy today to have our second annual quantum panel after a successful foray last year. We have Shaun Maguire back from Google Ventures who will be moderating. We have a number of other people in the quantum ecosystem we're happy to have here. Starting on the far end, we have Terry from Psi Quantum, so representing the entrepreneur side. We have Harmut from Google. We have Ilyas from Cambridge Quantum, and we have Carl from Accenture. So a number of interesting viewpoints I think we'll be able to represent and hopefully get you guys educated a little bit on the space, as well as kind of ask that big question about, when's it coming? Are we there yet? And what should I do in my own professional and personal life? So without further ado, Shaun, I'll hand it off to you.
Perfect. So I'll just brag about these guys in a little bit more detail, set the stage just a little bit more. I'll let them say a little bit more about themselves, and then we'll run through some questions. So Terry, before Psi Quantum, was a very eminent professor at Imperial College, one of the kind of pioneers of something called photonic approach to quantum computation. You can see he's very, very humble, but he's a big name in the field. And then Psi Quantum is a stealth company taking photonic approach, and they're a very, very impressive organization. I'm not an investor, so I'm not incentivized to say that. Harmut, he's a long-time machine learning entrepreneur, kind of a famous guy in the Google engineering organization who kind of built up the quantum org from scratch, runs that, but also kind of sits even above that and still does some fundamental AI work at Google. And Ilyas is a long-time entrepreneur and pretty famous man in the London scene. He's CEO of Cambridge Quantum, which has both software and hardware play. He was the chairman of the Stephen Hawking Foundation for a long time and was close friends with Stephen Hawking. And anyways, man of many talents. And Carl runs the quantum group at Accenture, which has pretty good visibility into how Fortune 500 companies are thinking about the space. And he also works closely with their venture group, and they've made a couple pretty big investments. So anyways, now that I've embarrassed you guys a little bit, anything I got wrong you want to clarify, or should I jump into questions? All right.
It's fine with me.
So first question, a lot of people are curious about the timeline. When is quantum going to start to be meaningful and relevant? How would each of you define useful in terms of quantum, and what do you think is the timeline for when we can start to do useful things? We'll go in order. Whoever wants to start.
Sure, I'll take a stab at it. I think what we are finding is that companies need to start now in order to capitalize on the investment for when quantum will be ready. We're focused on identifying the business cases, the use cases, as well as the understanding of the actual challenge or the problem that a company is facing, and projecting that out based on the technology that's available today. And so we generally have the consensus, I think in the community as well as if you're involved in the community, that chemical simulations are going to be the first types of problems that we see some of the hardware breaking through and being available for in the next 2 to 5 years, I'll say loosely. After that, we think that optimization and machine learning type problems in the 2, 5, 7-year area. Following that, security use cases or examples of where we see actual inflection point on when security and quantum actually come into ties where cryptography may potentially be breaking. We're looking at 10 plus years, as well as the actual traveling salesman or very deep-rooted optimization problems that we have a very good understanding, looking for a little bit further out. So that's how we view it right now.
How about you, Ilyas?
So I won't repeat where I'm in agreement, but I just want to say that I think quantum technologies need to be slightly differentiated from computing and processing using qubits. So on the quantum technology side, I think we're there. I think in metrology, sensors, quantum compass, these things are clearly now commercial and commercially available. I think the thing which perhaps has been a little bit in stealth is the idea of a quantum source for non-deterministic entropy, which has many, many use cases. So I think that perhaps is the next thing. And everything you've said, I would agree with. The only thing I would say is perhaps on the chemistry side, if the definition of commercialization is large global corporates actually paying significant value for time on machines as well as the algorithmic side, I suspect that that actually will happen this year. Not for use case on their own commercial product, but in order to do the preparatory work.
Just before we go to Harmut, I want to say there are a bunch of other quantum experts in the room that aren't on this panel, and when he says, quantum sources of true randomness, there's actually two guys from a company sitting right over there. It's Crypt, and that's what they're working on. So, anyways, Harmut.
So you asked the question, are we there yet? Anybody who has kids, they know this question. So obviously, quantum computing requires sustained investment over a period of time. But whenever you're in such a setting, you want to give clear milestones along the way, essentially lights along the runway where you're going. And from Google, it's well known. We set out a set of milestones. And I will only talk about the first one that we hope to hit. And it has a somewhat unfortunate name of quantum supremacy. You may have heard about this term. Its term was actually introduced by the Feynman professor here at Caltech, John Preskill. And it describes the situation where your quantum chip does something quick, let's say in seconds, but you go with the same computational benchmark to a classical supercomputer. Let's say the top one supercomputer right now is the Summit machine at Oak Ridge. And that machine would need for the same task, let's say a week or 10 days, something long. Then we would call this quantum supremacy. And we have been working hard to build chips that can achieve it. And we think we are very close to that goal. And once you have achieved this, then there's a new computational capability on the block, because that means that at that point or shortly thereafter, there are certain computations you can only do on a quantum processor, nowhere else. And that is not by any means the end of the road. We have to go to practical applications then, but it's definitely a good starting point when quantum comes into its own.
As the last person to respond, it's always difficult, other than to warn you to be careful of believing anything that any expert says, including my co-panelist. There's this wonderful story with the transistor. They asked Bardeen at Bell Labs. His manager asked him, what is this going to be useful for? And the story goes that what Bardeen responded was to build a better hearing aid. To which I like to think the manager's response was, what? What did you say? Because we tell people what they want to hear, but when you have a truly new technology, it's extremely difficult to predict. All we can say about quantum, echoing what these guys have said, is that there are intermediate types of things. You should think of them a bit like the transistor radio or the hearing aid, things that we are aiming for along the road, quantum technologies that aren't the equivalent of a sort of fully programmable universal device. That fully programmable device is extremely hard. We're trying very hard at PsiQuantum to build it, but that's something that takes about 1 million qubits roughly. And right now, we're talking tens of qubits in the lab. So, it's difficult to predict the future, particularly when you're sitting in the past. But the reason that we go for it with such enthusiasm is that we see that the potential uses are as disruptive as something like the printing press or the standard classical computers of the last 60 years.
Love that answer. So maybe so that you don't have to go last every time, I'll make you go first for this one. We'll kind of cycle back and forth. There's many different hardware approaches to quantum computing. You're doing photonic approach. Harmut's, leading a group that's using superconducting qubits and just trapped ions and all sorts of other architectures. When we get to the kind of long-term goal of 1 million qubit universal quantum computer, do you think it's going to be like one hardware approach that like winner take all, or do you think it will kind of be a multitude of approaches that will be integrated into some hybrid architecture?
I think that the consensus is that some sort of distributed or networked architecture will be necessary for all hardware platforms. You can't put 1 million superconducting qubits in a cryostat and cool them down to millikelvin temperatures. So most approaches, ion superconducting qubits, look at doing some sort of hybrid approach where they use photonic, I guess, interactions between different distributed quantum processors. In what we're doing, that at some level is easy because we already encode our information in photons. But we're talking, at least for the approach that we're taking, which is to use only the same silicon architecture that's used in your laptops and phones. We're still talking about roughly a small data center size facility to build 1 million physical qubits, and that'll be networked with fiber, and it will look very similar at some level to a current data center.
Any different answers? Or?
Yeah, as said earlier, getting to the full error-corrected machine will take some time, and making predictions over such extended time periods is by nature difficult. For now, we feel pretty good with our choice of superconducting qubits because we can leverage a lot of the technologies that have been developed with a lot of investment in the semiconductor industry. But as I say, in Silicon Valley, only the paranoid survives, so we keep looking around and seeing what competitors are doing to see is there any other architecture that may be more advantageous, and then we would have no shame to pivoting to that new technology.
Yeah, I would say traditionally, if you look at the past, there's been multiple architectures that have always been available for different types of compute, and I don't see that changing. I think one of the things that we're much more aware of is edge devices may need a different type of compute than, say, a satellite data center or a laptop, and eventually maybe we only need one large quantum computer that can suffice for many different aspects. So really the jury's still out.
But really, just to supplement, Shaun, it's clear that people are getting a little bit religious about the choices they've made, and rightly so. You've got to be passionate about the choice you've made. But the facts are, this is a largely non-quantum audience. The facts are that the large corporates that have got the large sustainable budgets are split, and the outlier is clearly Microsoft. Microsoft have decided to go down a route which we have to mention and acknowledge. It's a very serious effort, and of course, if that wins, then we all know that that could be a game changer. But at the non-American level, just giving, let's say, a sort of a European perspective, I think the ion trap route seems to be the one that is a little bit more favored by the weight of money, as opposed to the choice of the architectures. We keep an index, I'm sure other people do. There are at least 70 credible, informed, funded projects to build a quantum processor. And I only know of one topological qubit, and the rest are split evenly between the superconductors and the ion traps, and then a couple of photonics.
Yeah. Great answer. So I always like to ask some questions that I haven't heard before in these types of panels. So what's one misconception you want to clarify about quantum? Let's start with you, Harmut.
There are many misconceptions around, like one that you see often in the press is sort of this, often referred to as quantum parallelism, because for those who don't know, the one amazing fact that quantum physics teaches us about the world is that our world is way more interesting than meets the eye. See, if as a computer scientist or as a physicist using computer science, if you describe a system, you use a few bits, let's say coins. You throw 3 coins on the floor, and then you see one configuration, let's say heads, 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 or tails, tails, heads. And the equations of physics work such, of classical physics work such, that if you wanted to know where the system is in the future, you have to keep track of this configuration. But quantum mechanics tells you something more interesting. It says, hey, the other configurations that you don't see right now, they're also somewhere. This is associated with the term parallel universes. And you have to take these other configurations into account also if you want to make a high precision prediction where the system winds up. This is referred to as quantum parallelism, and indeed is a source of where quantum computers take their enormous power from. But it's not quite the same as traditional parallel computing, and that's often sort of mixed up in ways that's not correct.
Anyone else, any misconceptions you want to clarify?
Yeah, I would say very commonly people come in with the misconception that quantum computing is directly applicable and related to big data, and it's not necessarily just about big data problems. It's complex mathematical problems that it's helpful to solve, and it can be something very simple and just involve a matter of a couple numbers that is difficult for our traditional compute to do.
I think could I add to that by saying I think it's difficult to get across sometimes that there are problems we as humans will never solve unless we build a quantum computer. Some part of what we will do with it, yes, is stuff that we currently do. Maybe you'll price options slightly better and make money that way. But there are fundamental problems in science and technology that will never be solved. We cannot solve those problems without a quantum computer, and that's why we're so excited about it. That's why we throw all of this energy into it. And you say, well, like, what is it that makes it so special? And the way I like to explain it now is just that a quantum computer adds in a logical element that is not there in classical computers. Classical computers all use the same fundamental logic. It's the logic of Boolean algebra, of truth and false, and not, and or, and circuits, and stuff you might have heard of. And that logic follows the way that we as humans think. And yet, a quantum computer has just one logical element that goes beyond that. And we can't think like that. It's hard to program quantum computers because it's hard for us to think in the way a quantum computer does. But that is what allows us to tackle problems that will never be solved on a regular classical computer, even if we turn all of the silicon on this planet into a computer.
Just a very quick supplement, really. I'm entirely in Terry's camp on this. I mean, the number of times people ask, well, what will quantum computers do? I think we don't know, actually. I think there's this famous image of Isaac Newton standing in front of this ocean and saying that, I may have discovered a little drop of this and there's an ocean ahead of me of what will be discovered. And I think that's really true as far as quantum computing use cases are concerned. But being a little bit more specific, for every time somebody wanted to know whether a quantum computer will price an option better, I guess we'd be all very rich. But the impact, at least in the short term, the next 3 or 4 years, is in quantum chemistry, is in new materials, and fundamental human problems, energy, the photovoltaic process. These are the things that actually we ought to be excited about.
Lots of great answers there. Next question, again, maybe a little non-standard. Both China and the US have made quantum technologies a strategic priority the next decade, both China investing significantly more than the US, maybe as things are going these days. But if you could get a piece of advice to the Trump administration in terms of their quantum policy going forward, what would it be?
Should I go first as a non-American?
Yeah.
No, Terry's not American. Well, I'd add 2 other regions where quantum has become strategic. One is the European Union, and of course the United Kingdom was a very early adopter. Yeah. So in the UK, my advice to President Trump would be that adopt a quantum readiness program, and the UK has done that. And the point there is that we look at the top 50 corporates and we say to them, how will quantum computing or quantum technologies affect your decisions as far as this business cycle is concerned? And most people can't answer that. Most large corporates can't. BP, British Aerospace, Glaxo, Barclays. And the Quantum Readiness Program is equipped to be objective, grounded, not consultants going in, telling them what they want to hear. It is all about allowing the corporate sector to be informed about how they can answer that question. So perhaps that might be my advice.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, so along the same lines, I think that right now, so companies right now are embracing quantum to what level they think they understand it, or to what use cases they can map to it. Many of the companies that I work with have R&D programs. I think that if there was some incentive, increased incentives for them to beef up their R&D programs, say increasing the current tax rate or tax quotas from 14% benefit to higher than that for large companies, as well as maybe even a higher tax break for startups to do the R&D onshore in the U.S., and that may accelerate some of the work that we're doing here and drive growth for the country.
So I wouldn't say this to Trump, but maybe to humankind as a whole. See, my house is down the street there in Malibu. And a few months ago, we had terrible fires there. So most of my neighbors' houses are gone. We got lucky, ours is still there. But it was a stark reminder that we are 7 billion people now. We are going to 8 billion people. We don't have the industrial foundations to give 8 billion people a Western-style lifestyle unless we redo the industrial foundations on how we feed people, how we sustain lifestyle. And we have to do this really quickly. And there are not that many good ideas around. And a quantum processor will allow us to redo the industrial foundation. So if you quickly needed to make better batteries, better solar cells, better desalination plants, fusion reactor, and all these systems need to model or simulate quantum processes. And currently we can't do it. So yeah, it's very slow progress there, because every time you have an idea for a new battery, you have to make the battery. You have to go in the lab and measure it. With a quantum processor, you could simulate millions of battery candidates in seconds and only takes 100 best designs into the lab. So I think we need a quantum processor to save our ass.
Yeah. Agreed.
Yeah. That's a great comment. Let me just echo something or add to what Ilyas said, which is, so in our company, the vast majority of people that we employ were trained overseas. It's difficult to get them here. That's partly because in this country, the good students who studied quantum technology then go off and do boring jobs like venture capital, like our host up here. But so we're trying to bring these people in, and it's difficult to get them in. And this just seems completely mad to me. I don't care how xenophobic you are, to stop the sort of most talented PhD scientists coming into your country is completely crazy. But that's our president.
Just as a quick story along those lines, not about me. I won't take the bait on that. But one of my very close friends is a physics professor at Stanford, and he's a Canadian citizen. His wife is from Czech Republic. They've been married for 1 year and 8 months now. He's on a green card. He's a professor at Stanford, and his wife, they applied for a visa 14 months ago. She still doesn't have a visa, so she's still living in Europe. They see each other once a month, and we're going to lose him. He's going to leave his Stanford faculty job and go to Europe if we don't solve this visa issue for his wife immediately. Anyways, it's the situation with visa immigration for highly skilled people is very concerning right now. Mm-hmm. So anyways, last question. What resources would you recommend for curious people in the audience to learn more? I know Ilya has one.
Oh, well, I'm going to plug Terry's book. Terry won't tell you himself, but if you're... Well, there are two aspects of this. One is the compute aspect, but one is the foundational aspect of why is this stuff different. And if you want to... I have children as well. So if you want to teach your kids, then get Terry's book, Cures for Quantum. That's my plug for Terry.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ilya.
Yeah, if you're a business-focused audience and you just want to get an understanding, we have Accenture.com/quantum has a really good report that walks through it at a level that is digestible for that type of audience. I also think the progress and I can't forget the other word. The report. There was a recent report that came out where a lot of big names got behind putting together what the current state of the technology is, and maybe one of you guys remember the name of it, but there are really good resources out there if you want to get into it.
If nothing else, we've got 1 minute, 20 seconds. Any final comments? Anything we missed that anyone wants to say?
Since this was the moment for plugs, it's not really a plug, but we just published 4 very short videos explaining fundamental concepts in quantum computing. Google, so you can see them. It's for the Google AI Quantum Lab. It's 4 videos, 5 minutes short, and they are design. I think they're very nicely done and for a broad audience. So you will understand quantum computing much, much better after digesting these few videos.
I did bring 4 or 5 copies of the book. I'm happy to give them away. They're unsigned. If you want the signed copy, it'll cost you about 50 million. But then I'll throw in a small fraction of a quantum computing company. Just come see me afterwards.
Just throw that in.
I mean, so to elevate on that, they're raising, PsyQuantum's raising money right now. I highly recommend if you're an investor in the room, you take a look at the company. I am not an investor. It's just a very impressive company. All right, we've got 10 seconds, so let's end it there. Thanks, everyone.